Hello, Marley Banks. I'm here on behalf of Central Australian Frack Free Alliance.
My name's Jesse Hancock, also here on behalf of Central Australian Frack Free Alliance. And just note that they have about 450 members based in and around Alice Springs currently.
Thank you. When you're ready.
Hello and welcome back to Alice Springs. Thanks for the opportunity to address you again. So CAFA, we met at the initial hearings here in town, and we are a community group of roughly 450 members, and we've got serious concerns over the impacts of the unconventional shale gas industry here in the Northern Territory. Since presenting to the inquiry in Alice Springs in March, CAFA has continued to engage the local community and reach out to communities across Central Australia. Based on deep engagement of and conversations with the community, CAFA's position remains strong. CAFA is advocating for a total ban on fracking in the Northern Territory. An overview, in reading over the interim report, CAFA observed that there was not much attention paid to the Amadeus Basin. We know there's a considerable pressure to frack for more gas given the approval of the NGP Gemina project, and which they're publicly stating that it's expected to run at capacity, and that Central Petroleum has been a target customer and they're local here. As such, this presentation aims to focus somewhat on the Amadeus Basin. So CAFA urges the inquiry to pursue an in-depth scientific analysis of the Amadeus Basin, and is also mindful of the need for greater study of surrounding basins such as the Arthur Creek Formation and the Pedrika Basin, and they're all outlined on the map in the report. In this presentation, we'll first cover over social impacts, highlighting gaps and areas of concern in the interim report, and the presentation will then touch on some environmental concerns in regards to fracking and the Amadeus Basin. So on social impact, there's global evidence of people turning against coal, oil and gas. Around the world, we're seeing massive opposition to these legacy industries. We can look across to the Keystone XL pipeline in the United States, and we see the project, is in limbo despite the Trump administration's mass support. To quote, a final Nebraskan Public Service Commission hearing on the Keystone last week showcased the depth of opposition to the pipeline in the state, while a local farmer has attracted attention for installing American-made solar panels on his land to protest the project. This is a symbolic as well as a disruption. So it's a symbolic gesture by the farmer to put up these solar panels in line of the pipeline, but it's also staggering and slowing down the process of that pipeline, and now we're seeing that it's in limbo. When we're considering the social licence to operate, I draw the panel's attention to a very clear statement from the executive summary on the report. Overwhelmingly, the message received from the people who attended these meetings was that fracking was not safe, was not trusted, and was not wanted in the Northern Territory. I'm sure you're hearing that loud and clear across your engagement in the communities. So as an incorporated body, we are in communication, that is CAFA, with groups across Australia and the world. These connections are maintained with the interest of sharing information and experience relating to fracking and the many risks that it poses. We're going to draw to a diagram. It's through these connections we've been drawn to the attention of this slide. It shows quite a revealing image that shows the Bakken oil fields, which is in North Dakota, Minneapolis and Chicago. We can see that Chicago has a population of 7.2 million people, and we see that in the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And the Bakken oil fields are in fact lit up by shale gas flares. The North Dakota population is 758,000 people, so it's a real indication that the invasive methods that we see in unconventional shale gas have huge impacts on our landscape. And that has a clear indication that the density really does light up the night skies. So there's a reason globally why people are turning against this, despite the rhetoric from mining companies only being a hole in the ground. We can see clearly that it is very invasive and it does industrialise our landscape on a mass scale. We can have a look now at an alternative image, which is in a Tibetan plateau in eastern China. These are 4 million solar panels that silently soak up the sun as part of the Long Yang Zia, I believe it's pronounced, Dam Solar Park. It's the largest solar farm in the world, and it spreads over 16.09 square kilometres in the high desert landscape. And this solar farm can power over 140,000 typical homes. We've included this image, not to go into great detail about the scientific capacity of solar, but to demonstrate the strong reasons that people across the globe are turning away from this exploitive use of natural resources, such as gas, and turning to renewable options. Socially, people are motivated on this issue not by economics, but rather from concern for the natural environment and what effects this looming industry will have on the landscape that we rely. It must be understood that we find ourselves in a unique period of anthropogenic climate change, and individuals are now steering themselves towards alternative energy options above legacy industries, despite industry or government pressures. And this is just an example, and it kind of it does show that even if government does choose to progress this industry, Territorians are not prepared to accept the outcome of fracking. We acknowledge that the inquiry has identified that there is a diversity of communities across the Northern Territory, and that the social impact study has been outsourced to Coffee Tech Company. We note that social impact studies without adequate consultation cannot acceptably produce fair representation on behalf of communities. To accurately reflect the social fabrication of the Northern Territory as a whole, all communities, regardless of size or demographic across the Territory, deserve the right to be given the opportunity to participate equally, and this would require the panel visiting every community, ensuring appropriate consultation with consideration to time, access and culture. Whilst we are non-Indigenous people, we can speak on behalf of numerous Aboriginals, and we cannot speak on behalf of numerous Aboriginal communities across the Northern Territory. It's necessary to attempt to understand the systems of law and culture that underpin connection to the land. A quote is, "It was their belief that by caring for country and not over-exploiting the available resources, the land would in turn sustain them. The person takes care of the country and the country takes care of the person." And noted within the interim report, Aboriginal people make up most of the resident population of the areas that are highlighted for this industry. As a community, Aboriginal people must be able to maintain their cultural traditions relating to that land, so that it can carry on for generations. We can look towards other values of Indigenous cultures across the world. There's a 7th generation principle taught by the Native Americans, which says that in every decision, be it personal, governmental or corporate, we must consider how it will affect our descendants 7 generations into the future. This was first recorded anywhere between 1140 to 1500 AD. It's the great law of the Iroquois Confederacy, and interestingly it helped influence and form the American Constitution. Teddy Roosevelt was highly impressed by their system of law, and in fact didn't take the English principles but was guided by these teachings. The 7th generation principle today is generally referred to in regards to decisions made about energy, water, natural resources, and ensuring those decisions are sustainable for 7 generations into the future. And we can draw from this value system an insight into Indigenous cultural values that the land is sacred and usually given by a creator or supreme being, directly contradicting the worldview that the land and the resources should be available for development and extraction for the benefit of humans. As we've started to witness climate change taking place, the worldview is shifting towards an understanding of the importance of preserving the natural environment and setting limits so not to overexploit our available natural resources. If in the Paris Accord, it's noted that acknowledging climate change actually is a broader statement to include Indigenous people, but also the rights of all humans. We note that there's a gap in the report, that it does not clearly recognise the rights to all Territorians as affected groups of people, those living in remote communities as well as those in larger towns and cities. We have an ask in recognising Australia's commitment to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Paris Agreement. It's crucial that we acknowledge basic human rights surrounding the threats that shale gas imposes on Indigenous and non-Indigenous people of the Northern Territory. The report must expand to give fair representation to all. And we can, this bit might get you to help me with, the panel we ask the panel to recommend a way that the government can attain a social licence from all Territorians. This could look like a region-by-region citizen jury prior to fracking commences in an affected area, or it could look like a territory-wide option where everyone has a say that could come in the form of a referendum on the issue. A second ask on the social aspects is what guarantee can the panel give that the coffee tech company will adequately consult with all communities in the Northern Territory.
Thanks. Now I'd like to focus now a little more on the environmental concerns of hydraulic fracturing, and particularly try and focus on the Amadeus Basin, as it's not mentioned overly in the report. I'll just start by talking a little bit about re-injection, and acknowledging that it is said that re-injection is very closely linked to increased seismicity in the ground. Santos, a quote from a submission to the inquiry, that Santos also stated that given the low population density and lack of infrastructure in the area of its operations in the Amadeus Basin, the induction of seismic events is not considered a plausible risk to well integrity. Let's seek some clarification on this statement, as it's linking population density to risk on well integrity. So at the end, if we get some clarity on that, that would be great. And the report goes on to mention re-injection a few times, noting the Amadeus Basin as the only potential site for re-injection in the Territory. And that's on page 31, where it says there are no known potential sites for re-injection of flowback water into conventional hydrocarbon formations in the Northern Territory outside the Amadeus Basin. From there, the report is somewhat ambiguous into the actual recommendation on re-injection. Page 54 stating that preliminary assessment is that the practice of injecting wastewater into aquifers should not occur. And then on page 57 stating that until further information is obtained to determine whether or not the risks associated with this practice can be managed to acceptable levels, the practice of disposal of wastewaters by re-injection of untreated wastewaters into aquifers should generally not be permitted. The term generally is a bit open there, and given the Amadeus Basin is highlighted by the companies as a potential site for re-injection, I would seek further clarity on a strong position on this, and particularly in relation to the Amadeus Basin. So given this, the ask would be around the report needs to be more clear and firm in its recommendation that this practice should not occur, even in areas such as the Amadeus Basin, where there are conventional hydrocarbon formations and already a push from companies to use this area as a re-injection site. I'll move on to water supply now. As has already been stated by numerous people, the Amadeus Basin only has episodic recharge based on large rainfall events, and these rainfall events are quite rare and unpredictable. There is no substantial analysis in the interim report of potential groundwater for use outside of the Alice Springs water that's currently covered by a water allocation plan. I certainly found it difficult to find detailed analysis of water supply available in the Amadeus Basin that is outside of the Morini aquifer that Alice Springs currently draws water from. But it is clear that any alternate aquifers that are in the basin are certainly not as large as the Morini aquifer where Alice Springs draws its water from. And having spoken with a hydrologist who worked specifically on the Amadeus Basin, I can provide his name and research at a later date due to the short turnaround between the interim report and this. I didn't have time to get on record. But it was acknowledged that there is, and has been for many years, a great need for baseline studies in the basin in its entirety, the Amadeus Basin that is, before any judgment for the capacity of fracking in relation to water supply. To put the water use in perspective, Alice Springs has used 250,000 megalitres of water since 1964, which is approximately 4,700 megalitres per year. Conservative estimates in the interim report state that a development containing up to 1,200 wells over a 25-year period could require an average of 5,000 megalitres per year. and this is in relation to the Beetaloo Subbasin. That's stating that if such a development were to occur in the Amadeus Basin, it's equivalent to having enough water to support a second settlement the size of Alice Springs. And given the concern taken amongst Alice Springs residents to conserve water because we're told that water is scarce, I would suggest that there's not an unending source of groundwater in the Amadeus Basin that is yet to be discovered and somehow seems to be what these companies might be relying upon. On biodiversity and conservation, CAFA notes the panel is considering making a recommendation that onshore shale gas development should be excluded from all conservation reserves and sites of conservation significance. And we commend the panel for that. In his book, Biodiversity and Conservation, Jeffries notes the following, and I'll quote, "Effective use of protected areas now recognises the importance of ecological processes and change. Reserves should not be set up which are too small, fragmented or isolated so that their ecology is not sustainable. Reserves must account for evolutionary processes and genetic variety. There is a risk with the current recommendation that it could result in numerous small reserves or sites of cultural significance. And while conservation reserves and sites of significance should be excluded from gas development, baseline studies are needed to ensure these are large areas that take all biodiversity into account. An example of this might be the water in Palm Valley, Fink Gorge or Boggy Hole, all of which could be affected by gas mining anywhere in the Amadeus Basin, even hundreds of kilometres south, but would not be protected if it is simply a reserve around those specific sites. And I would say this goes for any significant tourist site in NT as well, which has come up earlier today. So I asked there that there be a comprehensive analysis into the Amadeus Basin water supply and aquifers prior even to case-by-case analysis of each potential fracking site. I want to talk a little bit about wells. Not only does fracking expose the Amadeus Basin aquifer to waste as a product of the fracking, that's the chemicals of concern, but there are potential other chemical contaminants likely to be in the ground. This is of particular concern given the panel's trust in modern wells, and the panel's preliminary view was that technology is improving, and certainly agree with that, but any testing of wells we know has to happen over tens, if not hundreds of years to be entirely sure on that, and a precautionary principle would say that why not wait 100 of years to test those wells before opening up the territory to that kind of risk. So what proof is there that the outlined improvements will last that test of time? And this is of particular importance in areas like the Amadeus Basin, where that area is open to all sorts of other chemicals. Just in 2016, the government pushed to have a nuclear waste dump just south of Alice Springs, which is on the basin. There was significant community opposition to that. And more recently, a proposal for a salt mine that would double as a waste burial facility near the community of Tichikala, which sits on the eastern edge of the Amadeus Basin. So I include this just to note that there are other chemicals in the ground and things going on, and pressures from the government, state government and national government that use this as a bit of a burial site. So I'm going to ask here that the companies that currently have mining operations in the territory do release for the public and this inquiry well site inspection records, and that's from every company that's operating in the territory. We know they keep records of well site inspection, and it would be good to be able to access them. So I might just hand over to Marley to talk about alternative power options.
Having listed a few environmental concerns relating to fracking occurring in the Amadeus Basin, it's also worth noting the great potential that exists in an alternative means of energy in this region. The panel has noted from the interim report that there's significant concern regarding Australia's ability to meet goals set out in the Paris Accord. While we have no disagreement in the panel's findings that gas extraction may result in less emissions than coal, quoted as less than half, the question is, why is this the major comparison that we can make? If we have a look, we have a world map of direct normal irrigation, which is different to direct horizontal irrigation. And actually you can see that Australia is the continent that has the greatest direct normal irrigation. And if we then go to have a look at the Northern Territory, you can see that even more specifically, Central Australia and the Amadeus Basin actually falls completely within the highest concentration of direct normal irrigation in the world. You'll see that the research shows that the greenhouse gas emissions from PV to be 4.4% of that emitted by coal. Have I missed a bit from here? I think I might have. Noted in the report, it says that gas is 50% lower than coal in its life cycle. We can have a look at this diagram which we've included, which takes into account if we're taking coal at 50%, gas is 50% of coal, we're looking at 500 grams of CO2 equivalent to the kilowatt hour. But if we have a look at the life cycle stages of photovoltaic at the top, it's 40 grams, which is 8% of the emissions of gas, which is pretty staggering and inspiring considering our direct normal irradiation availability and an untapped resource. We have an ask with this information that comparing to unconventional and conventional gas sources, the report needs to be expanded to include life cycle stages of renewables as the NT's highest potential of direct normal irradiation to be captured in the form of solar PV.
Yeah, to clarify, and lots of people raised this with you yesterday, but yes, I understand it's a relevant comparison to have greenhouse gas emissions between coal and gas. But just adding a further layer to that would seem logical given the information is there on this stuff. And it is a real alternative option specifically for the Territory and Central Australia. So that ends the large chunk of our presentation. And thank you for the opportunity to present to you. We're very happy with the process of the inquiry so far. We'll just end with a question to the panel as to how this process, the process of the inquiry, will ensure that the Amadeus Basin is a no-go zone for shale gas fracking.
We have noted that submission. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just had a couple of remarks. Appendix 10 sets out the scope of services for the social assessment modelling. At page 152, if you have a look at 3.7 C and D, there we have asked, specifically we've asked Coffee to basically look at the measures that the industry and government can take to enable the industry, should the government lift a moratorium, to obtain a social licence to operate and how it may do so. So we have asked Coffee to effectively come up with some suggestions in that respect. And indeed, in relation to consultations, one of the difficulties, and I've spoken about this publicly before, with getting anyone to do a territory-wide social impact modelling is we just simply don't have the data of what this industry may look like. Again, should the government lift the moratorium at a territory-wide level, we do have some data. It's not much, but we have some from the Beetaloo, which is why we have asked Coffee to concentrate only on the Beetaloo, and then the framework from the Beetaloo can be adapted elsewhere in the territory once that data becomes available and if the moratorium is lifted. So that's why they're concentrating on the Beetaloo. That's what they've been asked to do, and that's what's made explicit at Appendix 10 in relation to the scope of services. Thank you. Yes, Professor Hart.
Thank you for your submission focusing on the Amadeus Basin. A couple of points I'd make. On page 35, you've probably seen there that we note that while there are prospective unconventional gas exploration and development potential, it's not considered, well, it's considered unlikely, and mostly there'll be conventional plays there. So that's the first point. The second one is, as has been pointed out by the Chair, we focused on Beetaloo because that's where the greatest potential at the moment is, that's being explored, and we have reasonable, not entirely, but reasonable information. So we can make some statements there. But our terms of reference, as you probably note, is that we should be looking at all of the NT. So Amadeus Basin is part of NT. So your comments that you made about the need for baseline studies, water, terrestrial, aquatic biodiversity, all of those sorts of things, they will be the types of recommendations, if the government does lift a moratorium, would have to be done. So I think you can rest assured that your comments are taken into consideration and they'll be part of an overall assessment.
Sure, and I take that into account for this panel, and I guess what was clear from the interim report is that Territorians have a strong distrust of fracking and mining companies, and in some sense, regardless of the regulation that's there or the government putting the brakes on until it exists, if the Beetaloo sub-basin is being successfully fracked and companies are getting a lot of gas out, companies that have permits on the Amadeus Basin are unlikely to not try and compete with that. It's the nature of the industry so far in the Territory, and there's a concern there.
Plus, I also see that if given the green light to go, that will encourage those companies, which we know there's big prospective and actual licences that are all over this region. So if a gas industry does go ahead in the unconventional form, it's harder to undo those that have been legislated through government. So that's a risk.
As Professor Hart said, I mean, to the extent that we are enabled to make recommendations consistent with our terms of reference, if indeed there's just an absence of data there, those baseline studies haven't been done, then that is a recommendation that we'll make before the government can take any further step.
Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Anderson.
Yeah, thanks. I have a couple of questions. And first, one to you, Ms. Banks, and it's following up the issue of social licence. And you put forward the idea of maybe having regionally based citizen juries to assess, I presume what you meant, assess for their region the social licence for any potential development. And so I guess my question is, what if there were, and what if for a region, the local communities, including local Indigenous communities, supported the development of shale gas industry in their region? Would you be happy then to accept that, or what would your view be?
Well, I guess we have to speak on behalf of the membership that we represent, which is Central Australian Frack Free Alliance, and my independent thoughts upon that would be different to what we're doing here today. Our body of membership is supportive of a ban across the board. What that would look like if it was broken down, whether it be a referendum which went to everybody versus the citizen jury in specific areas, I guess that would have to be something that would be considered at the time. But on behalf of our membership supports this industry not going ahead.
That's a fair comment. You can only speak on behalf of your representative body, which is fair enough.
Yeah, look, thanks. And then a question for Mr. Hancock, and it's relating to water use. And you talked about what's the figure for the Alice Springs population uses about 4,000 megalitres a year for water. Do you have any idea of other water uses? So the pastoral industry, for example, do you have any figures for what the pastoral industry might be using in terms of water from that aquifer too?
No, I don't have them on me. I'm sure I could. I can endeavour to research and submit to the submission.
That would be helpful. Thank you. Well, Dr. Jones. Yes.
I've noted down here a comment that I think you made, and I'd just like a little bit of clarification. I've noted that apparently there is pressure for fracking to occur in the Amadeus Basin to feed the Jamina gas pipeline. Now, what's the basis for that assertion? Because it'd be interesting for us to hear that one.
Certainly, that's evidence based on the fact that the pipeline, obviously construction has begun on it, and there was an article out in the Financial Review, I think about 2 weeks ago, stating that the pipeline is contracting other customers at this stage. It mentioned Central Petroleum as one of those customers. We know that significant money will be spent building that pipeline, and it's only natural that there will be pressure for companies to produce gas to go through that pipeline.
So when you say Central Petroleum, they've got largely conventional gas at the moment, don't they? I know they've wound their gas production right back, but they could turn it back up again and send more gas up the pipeline.
Yeah, and they could turn it up through unconventional shale gas if that's allowed and open is the concern.
I think when looking at the maps, it clearly shows that areas that they have licences on have deposits of shale. So what's there to safeguard against them not pushing for unconventional once their conventional reserves run out or whatever it be?
Yes, Dr. Beck.
Yes, I was just going to comment upon the night photograph of showing Chicago and the Acken oil field. So it was a very dramatic photograph. I'm just wondering if you could kindly provide a reference where you got that photograph from in your detailed submission. And also just can you clarify, was that a single shot during the night, or was there time lapse involved in that, please?
We can definitely provide that information. It's actually a NASA photograph and it's taken from space.
Yeah, sure. Okay, that'd be good if you could do that. Thank you.
Any further comments? All right, last one, Professor Hart.
Just in terms of water use and the Amadeus Basin, it's very similar to what we believe will be the southern extent of Beetaloo. We've got information on the type of, or the amount of recharge up in the more northern part, up the Mataranka and the lake. We have no information down south. Very much lower rainfall, and you guys are even less rainfall. So as I think you pointed out, that the water supply for Alice is actually groundwater mining. That would be the same situation for any gas fracking operation. So it really puts it into a different context in terms of sustainability. I just want to point that out.
Sure. Noted. Yeah.
Again, thank you very much to CAFA for taking the time to present again to the inquiry. We're very grateful for your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you.